On June 13, 1996, two co-workers knocked on the door of an apartment in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Their colleague hadn't shown up for her new summer job, and that wasn't like her. When nobody answered, they went inside. What they found in that apartment at 444 I Street was Angie Dodge. She was 18 years old. She had graduated high school with honors the year before. She had moved into her very first apartment only a few weeks earlier. And now, she was gone. The Idaho Falls Police Department found a single unknown man's DNA at the scene. One profile, one man. It should have been the fastest case in the county. Instead, it became one of the worst failures in Idaho history, because the man who left that DNA had lived directly across the street. Police had already spoken to him in the first week and let him walk. And while the real killer drove out of town, detectives turned their attention to a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp, and they got a confession out of him, a confession the DNA never once supported. Christopher Tapp went to prison for a murder he didn't commit, and he stayed there for 20 years. The man who actually killed Angie Dodge was named Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. He wasn't caught by a witness. He wasn't caught by a break in the case. He was caught because, more than 2 decades later, a scientist took that same untouched sample of DNA and used it to build a family tree. This is the story of how the answer sat inside the investigation from week 1, how the wrong man paid for it, and how it finally took a brand new science to find the right one. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of forgotten victims who finally got justice. If that matters to you, subscribe. Before we get to that morning, you need to know who Angie was. Because she wasn't just a name in a case file, and she wasn't just the DNA profile that would go on to make legal history. She was a person, and the whole weight of this story rests on that. Angie Raye Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Vancouver, Washington. She was the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter. She had 3 older brothers, Brent, Todd, and Roger. In a house full of boys, Angie was the one with the infectious smile, the one who greeted people with hugs whether they wanted one or not. Her family remembered a vivacious girl with a personality that filled a room. She loved being outdoors. She loved nature, loved camping, loved being out under an open sky. She had a soft spot for the people around her. Every Christmas, Angie made handmade necklaces for her relatives, little ribbons strung with bells, made by hand, and given with that same easy warmth. She went cruising around Idaho Falls with her friends in an old car they'd nicknamed the Boat, a beat-up thing she loved right up until she traded it, only months before, for a new Chevy. She graduated from Idaho Falls High School in 1995, and she graduated with honors. All through high school, she'd tutored younger children in math and English, sitting patiently with kids who couldn't get the numbers to line up, helping them until they could. She briefly attended Idaho State University, and she had a dream that was bigger than Idaho Falls. Angie wanted to go into business for herself. She wanted to be an entrepreneur, to build something of her own. She was 18, and she was just getting started. In the late spring of 1996, that new life had begun. She'd moved out of the family home and into her own place, her first apartment at 444 I Street. It was a big step, and she was proud of it. She had a new car. She had a new summer job about to start. She'd talked her way into being an adult, one piece at a time. On the night of June 12, 1996, Angie went to see her mother, Carol. She showed up around 9:15 in the evening. The two of them had been at odds over a house rule, one of those small disagreements between a mother and a teenage daughter who's just left home, and Angie had come to make it right. They talked. Angie was bubbling over about the new apartment, about the independence, about everything that was ahead of her. She stayed about an hour. She left a little after 10:20 p.m., and on her way out, she said something to Carol that her mother would carry for the rest of her life. When Angie was a small child, she couldn't quite say the word little. She said whittle instead. It became a family thing, a private catchphrase between the two of them. That night, on her way out the door, 18 years old and standing on her own 2 feet, Angie turned to her mom and said it one more time. "I still whittle, huh, Mommy?" That was the last time Carol Dodge saw her daughter alive. Sometime after Angie got home to 444 R Street in the early hours of June 13th, A man came into her apartment. The killing was later placed within a window that ran roughly from just before 1 in the morning to just after 11. What happened inside is stated here once, plainly, and then set down. Angie was raped. She was killed by knife wounds to her throat, and she died from the loss of blood. She was 18 years old, alone in the first home she'd ever had to herself. Later that morning, she didn't show up for the new summer job she'd been so excited about. 2 of her coworkers noticed. It wasn't like her to just not appear, so they went to check on her. They went to 444 I Street, and they were the ones who found her. The Idaho Falls Police Department responded, and in those first hours, the crime scene handed them something that, in 1996, was still close to the leading edge of forensic science. At the scene, investigators recovered semen and hair. Those samples yielded a DNA profile of a single unknown male, not 2 men, not a crowd. 1 man's genetic profile left behind at the scene of the crime. Hold on to that fact because it is the thread that ties this entire story together, from that June morning all the way to a courtroom 25 years later. That one profile was the whole case. It was physical, it was specific, and it belonged to exactly one person on Earth. Everything that went right in this story and everything that went horribly wrong would come back to whether the police followed where that single profile pointed or whether they didn't. They didn't. In the days after the murder, IFPD did what police do. They canvassed the neighborhood. They went door to door around 444 I Street, knocking on the homes of everyone nearby, asking who'd seen what, who'd heard what, who Angie was, who might have wanted to hurt her. It's routine, and it's exactly right. The answer to a murder is very often close to home. In this case, it was closer than anyone realized. Directly across the street from Angie's apartment at 459 I Street lived a man named Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. He'd moved into that address that April. He was there the night Angie died. And roughly 5 days after the murder, around June 18, 1996, police knocked on his door too as part of that same canvass. They spoke to him as a neighbor, as a possible witness, one more man on the street who might have seen something. Then they moved on. He wasn't treated as a suspect. He wasn't pursued. Whatever he told them that day, he was crossed off and left alone. And in August of 1996, just a couple of months later, Brian Dripps packed up and left Idaho Falls altogether. What nobody knew in that summer of 1996 was that the man who left the DNA had just quietly removed himself from the map. There was no capability anywhere in Idaho in 1996 to take that crime scene profile and match it to an individual. DNA could tell you 2 samples came from the same man. It could not, on its own, hand you a name out of thin air. So with no suspect emerging from the canvas and no database to run the profile against, the trail across the street went cold before anyone knew it was a trail at all. And that is where the second failure began. Because a case this brutal, with a young woman raped and killed in her own apartment, does not simply stop. The pressure to solve it was enormous, and the police found someone to fill the space where the real killer had been. His name was Christopher Tapp. He was 20 years old. He wasn't a suspect at first, not really. Roughly 6 months into the investigation, in January of 1997, police brought him in for information about other people. They were looking hard at one of his acquaintances, a man named Ben Hobbs, and Tapp was, at the start, a source, someone who might know something about somebody else. It did not stay that way. Over the next several weeks, Christopher Tapp was pulled into an interrogation that would later be studied by experts as a textbook case of everything that can go wrong in an interview room. The core sessions ran from January 7th through January 18th, 1997. Across a span of about 23 days, he was interrogated 9 separate times and given 7 polygraph examinations, 7 lie detector tests on one 20-year-old. A judge would later say the polygraph had been used on him like a psychological rubber hose, a tool not to find the truth, but to break him into implicating himself. They offered him deals. In the middle of January 1997, Tapp signed immunity agreements, papers that promised him leniency in exchange for truthful statements. He was told that if he cooperated, if he gave them what they needed, he'd be protected. He signed, And then, on January 29, 1997, the prosecutors voided that immunity, tore it up. Once the DNA excluded the man he had named, they threatened him with death. Police told Christopher Tapp he could face execution. The gas chamber. A 20-year-old sitting in a room being told his life was on the line unless he talked. Steve Drizin, a confession expert from Northwestern University who studied the tapes years later, called it the worst example of police contamination and fact-feeding he had ever seen. Fact-feeding is exactly what it sounds like. It's when the details of a crime that only the real killer should know get handed to a suspect, fed to him piece by piece until he can repeat them back and it sounds like a confession. And so Tapp's story changed, and changed and changed again. First, he denied any involvement at all. Then he named Ben Hobbs. Then he added another man, Jeremy Sargis. Then a man he called only Mike. Each time the account shifted to survive the newest problem. And after police physically took him to the crime scene, to Angie's apartment, his story arrived at its final form. He claimed he had held Angie down while someone else attacked her. Every one of those shifts followed police pressure. Every one of them followed another round of DNA results that refused to cooperate. Because here's the fact that should have ended it, the fact that sat over the entire Tapp prosecution like a stone. The DNA never matched him, not once. Pretrial testing excluded Christopher Tapp as the source of the semen found at the scene. It excluded him before his trial ever began, and it excluded him every single time it was run. There was no physical evidence tying him to that apartment. None. So how do you convict a man whose DNA proves he wasn't the source? You invent a theory to explain it away. Police and prosecutors advanced the idea that there had been more than one attacker, that Tapp had been present and taken part, but wasn't the man who left the DNA. There was no evidence for a second attacker. The single male profile said the opposite, but the multiple attacker theory let them keep the confession and set the science aside. On May 28, 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted. The charges were aiding and abetting rape and first-degree murder with a deadly weapon enhancement. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years before he could even be considered for parole. A young man, convicted on a confession that the physical evidence flatly contradicted, sent away for the rest of his natural life. If this case is getting under your skin the way it should, subscribe. It didn't take Christopher Tapp long to say what he'd been trying to say all along. In 2001, he recanted. He stated plainly that the confession had been coerced, dragged out of him under threat and pressure, and that none of it was true. That same year, his direct appeal ran its course through the Idaho Court of Appeals, and he lost. The confession stayed in, the conviction stood, and the door to the prison closed behind him with no crack of daylight in it. He was not the only one who would later say police had leaned too hard. Years down the line, a witness named Destiny Osborne, whose account had helped the case against Tapp, recanted as well. In 2017, she said police had threatened her with drug charges. But that was far in the future. In 2001, Christopher Tapp was simply a young man in an Idaho prison telling anyone who would listen that he hadn't done it, while the evidence that could prove it sat untouched in an evidence locker waiting for a science that didn't exist yet. And so the years began to stack up. This is the part of the story that doesn't make the news, the long middle where nothing happens and everything is lost. The case, for all practical purposes, went quiet. The real killer was gone. The wrong man was locked away. And Angie's family was left to live inside a version of events that, though they didn't yet know it, was false from the foundation up. In 2004, Angie's father, Jack Dodge, died. He went to his grave believing, as far as the courts were concerned, that his daughter's killer was behind bars. He never learned that the man in prison hadn't done it. He never learned the real name. He died without the answer, one of the quiet casualties of a case gone wrong, a father who waited 8 years and got only a lie for his patients. But in that same stretch of years, something was shifting, and it was shifting in the most unlikely place imaginable. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, had originally wanted Christopher Tapp to die for what was done to her daughter. She had pushed for the death penalty. She had sat across a courtroom from him, believing with her whole heart that he was one of the men who took Angie from her. And then she started watching the tapes. Around 2008, Carol Dodge obtained copies of the interrogation and confession recordings and sat down to watch them. There were hours and hours of them, somewhere near 60 hours of tape. She didn't watch as an expert. She watched as a mother, the mother of the murdered girl, looking for the truth in the face of the man she'd wanted executed. And what she saw horrified her. She watched a young man being worn down, fed details, threatened, and steered. She watched the story get built in front of her, piece by piece, by the very people who were supposed to be finding the truth. And Carol Dodge came to a conclusion that must have cost her everything to reach. She decided the confession was coerced, contaminated, false. Think about what that meant for her. She had lost her daughter. Now she was concluding that the man convicted of the crime hadn't done it, which meant the person who actually killed Angie was still out there, unpunished and unnamed. Most people would have looked away. Carol did the opposite. The victim's own mother became the single most important advocate for freeing the man convicted of murdering her daughter. She began to fight for Christopher Tapp. She wasn't alone for long. Around 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project took up the case and began reviewing it. Carol brought in Steve Drizin, the confession expert, to examine the videos, and his assessment was damning. The Innocence Project in New York joined the defense. A group called Judges for Justice, made up of retired FBI supervisory special agents, produced a report running some 85 pages that concluded the confession was demonstrably false and the conduct behind it egregious. A public defender named John Thomas worked the case alongside them. Slowly, painstakingly, a coalition formed around the idea that Idaho had put the wrong man in prison. But the law does not move quickly, and it does not admit error easily. For years, all of that work pressed against a conviction that would not fall. And then, on March 22, 2017, came a resolution that was half a victory and half a wound that would not close. Tapp's defense reached an agreement with the Bonneville County prosecutor, Danny Clark. It was approved by District Judge Alan Stevens. Under the deal, Tapp's rape conviction was vacated outright. His murder sentence was reduced to time served. He had already been locked up for around 20 years. And so, on that day, Christopher Tapp walked out of prison a free man. But freedom came with a price written into the fine print. In exchange for his release, Tapp agreed to drop his remaining challenges to the murder conviction. That is the reason, strange as it sounds, that he walked out the door still technically convicted of Angie's murder. It was a negotiated release, a resentencing, not a declaration that he was innocent. The state let him go without ever admitting it had been wrong. He was out, but the word murderer was still hanging around his neck, unresolved, waiting. On the day he was released, Christopher Tapp said, "I never thought this day would come." He was free. But Angie's killer still had no name, and the case still had no answer. What it needed was something that hadn't been possible in 1996, hadn't been possible in 2001, and was only now, at the very end of the 2010s, becoming real. It needed the science to catch up, and it was about to. Here is the idea at the heart of everything that comes next, and it's worth understanding clearly, because it's the reason this case broke at all. That single male DNA profile, the one from the scene, the one that excluded Christopher Tapp for 20 years, never changed. Not one letter of it. The evidence was frozen in place from June of 1996 onward. What changed was not the sample. What changed was what science could do with it. For most of those years, the only way to match crime scene DNA to a person was to compare it against a known profile. Either a specific suspect sample or the profiles stored in a law enforcement database. If your man wasn't already in that database, if he'd never been convicted of the right kind of crime, his DNA could sit in evidence forever and never ring a bell. Brian Dripps had left no profile in any police system that would flag him. So for 2 decades, the sample sat there, a perfect fingerprint of the killer, pointing at a man the databases couldn't see. The technology that finally cracked it is called investigative genetic genealogy. And before it worked, it produced a warning of how badly it could go wrong. Back in 2014 and 2015, an earlier, cruder attempt used a search of a genetic database that Ancestry had acquired, the Sorensen database, focusing on the Y chromosome. That search wrongly pointed at a New Orleans filmmaker named Michael Usry. For a time, he was under suspicion for a murder he had nothing to do with. More complete DNA testing cleared him, and he was released in 2015. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder that a lead is not proof, and that the early forms of this science could point at innocent men. But the technology matured fast. By 2018, investigative genetic genealogy had become something far more powerful and far more careful. The Idaho Falls Police Department turned to a company called Parabon Nanolabs, based in Reston, Virginia. Parabon's lead genetic genealogist was a woman named CeCe Moore, one of the pioneers of the entire field. And in May of 2018, the Idaho Falls Police authorized the upload of the crime scene profile to a database called GEDmatch. Here is how the method actually works, in plain terms. You take the DNA from the crime scene and convert it into the same format that ordinary people get when they send a tube of spit to a consumer ancestry company. Then, you upload that profile to a database, in this case, GEDmatch, that allows law enforcement to search it. What comes back is not a photograph of the killer. What comes back is a list of relatives, distant cousins mostly, ranked by how much DNA they share with your sample. The unit for that shared DNA is the centimorgan. The more centimorgans two people share, the more closely they're related. From there, it becomes detective work stitched together with genealogy. You take those distant cousins and you build their family trees backward, up toward the common ancestors they share. Then, you work forward again, down through the generations, using public records, old newspapers, and obituaries, narrowing the branches until they converge on one person who fits the case. A man. The right age, in the right place at the right time. That person isn't a conviction. He's a lead, and the police still have to go get a direct sample from him to prove it. But it's a name where there had been nothing at all. That is exactly what CeCe Moore set out to do with the Angie Dodge profile, and she had to do it with one hand tied behind her back. The sample she was working from was degraded. 20-plus years old and never pristine to begin with, it came through with only about a 61% SNP call rate. SNPs are the specific genetic markers the whole method depends on, and she had barely more than half of them to work with. It was like trying to identify a face from a photograph with nearly 40% of the pixels missing. She worked it anyway. By early 2019, Moore had pulled her best matches out of the database, distant relatives sharing somewhere between about 85 and 95 centimorgans with the crime scene profile. That's not close family. That's the range of a distant cousin, several generations removed. But it was a foothold. She traced those matches back to common ancestral couples, a family line with the surname Usry, spelled in some branches as Usri, and began building the tree back down toward the present. The first trees she built surfaced 6 male descendants who could, in theory, have been the source. She checked them. None of them matched the case. 6 leads, 6 dead ends. For most investigations, that might have been the wall. But Moore kept pulling the thread. A distant genetic match, combined with an online obituary, revealed something the earlier trees had missed entirely: a 7th male descendant who hadn't shown up before. He'd been invisible for a specific and very human reason. His mother had remarried, and he'd been raised under a different surname than the family line the tree was built on. On paper, tracing the Usuri name forward, he simply didn't appear where a son should have been. He carried another name, and that 7th descendant, the one who'd slipped through the gap created by a remarriage and a changed last name, was a man named Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. The name landed with the Idaho Falls Police Department, the lead agency the whole time, and it must have landed strangely, because to the detectives who knew the case file, that name wasn't entirely new. Brian Dripps had been in Idaho Falls in 1996. He'd lived across the street from Angie. He'd been spoken to in the canvas. But genealogy hands you a lead, not proof, and the rule is absolute. Before you can act, you have to confirm it with a direct sample of the suspect's own DNA. So the investigation moved from the family tree back into the physical world, and it moved to Caldwell, Idaho, where Brian Dripps was now living. Police tracked him there and put him under surveillance. They watched, and they waited for the one thing they needed, a piece of Dripps himself that he would discard in public, something they could lawfully collect and test. On May 10, 2019, in Caldwell, they got it. Brian Dripps discarded a cigarette butt. Investigators collected it and sent it to the Idaho State Police Laboratory. The lab compared the DNA on that cigarette butt to the single male profile that had been sitting in evidence since June of 1996. The one that excluded Christopher Tapp, the one that had been the whole case and had never had a name, and in about 24 hours, the answer came back. It was a match. After nearly 23 years, a discarded cigarette closed the distance between a crime scene sample and a living man in a single day. On May 15, 2019, police arrested Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. in a traffic stop in Caldwell. And then, in the interrogation room, the last wall came down. Dripps confessed. He admitted that he had raped and killed Angie Dodge. He filled in the picture in his own words. He said that on that night he'd been severely impaired, wrecked on cocaine and alcohol. He said he had gone into the apartment intending to rape her and that he'd been carrying a pocket knife. When it came to the killing itself, he said it just happened. He claimed he had no memory of the fatal wound, but he did not deny inflicting it. And critically, he said he'd acted alone, one man, exactly what the single DNA profile had said from the very first day. There was no second attacker. There never had been. He confirmed the rest of it too, the part that turns this from a tragedy into an indictment. He confirmed that in 1996, he had lived directly across the street from Angie Dodge. He confirmed that after the murder, police had come to him as a neighbor and interviewed him. He had been right there, right across the street the whole time. He was spoken to in the first week and passed over, and then he'd driven out of Idaho Falls and lived his life, while the machinery of the justice system fixed itself onto a 20-year-old who'd left no DNA and sent him away for 2 decades. Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. was born in Idaho Falls. At his arrest in 2019, he was 53 years old, and by his sentencing, he was 55, which places him at roughly 30 years old in 1996, a grown man of 30 living across the street from an 18-year-old girl. After the murder, he had left town, and by 2019, he was in Caldwell, working in construction, driving a truck, doing labor, an ordinary-looking life in an ordinary Idaho town built on top of the one night he said he wished he could do over. His arrest set something else in motion, something that had been 20 years coming for a man in a different part of the state. On July 17, 2019, 2 months after Dripps was arrested and confessed, Christopher Tapp finally got the words he had waited more than 2 decades to hear. District Judge Alan Stevens vacated the 1998 murder conviction and cleared Tapp of all charges. There was no more negotiated middle ground, no conviction left hanging over him with the fine print attached. The judge spoke to him directly. "As far as the court is concerned," he said, "you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20-plus years." It was over. The word was lifted off him at last, and it made history. Christopher Tapp is recognized as the first person in the world to be exonerated with the aid of investigative genetic genealogy. The same science that named the real killer also freed the innocent man, in the same case, from the same untouched sample. The evidence that had been used to send the wrong man to prison, once the technology finally caught up to it, was the thing that set him loose and pointed at the right one. Now, the law turned to Brian Dripps. He was charged with first-degree murder and rape. At the start, he pleaded not guilty, and his defense moved to suppress his confession, arguing it had been taken in violation of his Miranda rights. But the physical evidence against him was not a coerced story or a fed detail. It was his own DNA, matched twice from the scene and from the cigarette, and his own recorded admission on top of it. On February 9, 2021, Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. pleaded guilty. He entered the plea in Bonneville County District Court before District Judge Joel Tingy under a plea agreement. The man who had been spoken to and passed over in the first week of the investigation stood in a courtroom nearly 25 years later and admitted what he had done. The sentencing came on June 8, 2021. Judge Tingy sentenced Dripps to 20 years fixed to life, meaning he would not even be eligible to be considered for parole until he had served 20 years, along with a $10,000 fine. Both sides noted that his health was failing. He'd suffered a heart attack in November of 2020 while he was jailed and awaiting resolution. In practical terms, everyone in that courtroom understood that a sentence of 20 years to life for a man of his age and condition was, in all likelihood, a sentence to die in prison. Carol Dodge stood in that courtroom. The mother who had lost her daughter in 1996, who had once wanted Christopher Tapp to die, who had then spent years fighting to free him, now faced the man who had actually done it. She spoke to him directly. "You have shattered our family," she said. "There is no way to pick up the pieces ever again." And then, plainly, without dressing it up, "I can't forgive you, ever." Dripps spoke too. "I just wish I could do over that night," he said. "I'm sorry." It was an apology 25 years too late, offered to a mother who had already told him it would never be enough. Dripps was sent to prison, and he remains incarcerated in Idaho and is still living, eligible to be considered for parole only after he serves his 20 years. No parole has been considered. For all practical purposes, given his age and his failing heart, the man who killed Angie Dodge will spend the rest of his life behind bars for it. But the story of what Idaho Falls did to Christopher Tapp did not end with his exoneration, because clearing a man's name does not give him back 20 years. In October of 2020, Tapp sued the city of Idaho Falls and former officers of its police department in federal court over the wrongful conviction that had taken half his life. And on June 9, 2022, the Idaho Falls City Council approved a settlement of $11.7 million. It came with something rarer than money. The city's mayor, Rebecca Casper, issued a written apology. She offered, in her words, "A sincere apology to you and to your mother, Mrs. Tapp, for the city's role in your wrongful conviction." A city government, in writing, admitting it, had helped put an innocent man away. The settlement also included a commitment that the city would discuss reforms to its interrogation techniques with leading experts, and in the time since, the department has worked with interrogation training firms to update how its officers are taught to question people. The methods that had manufactured a false confession out of a frightened 20-year-old were, at last, on the table to be changed. And Christopher Tapp had his life back. He had his name back, his freedom, and finally the acknowledgement and the means to try to build something out of what was left. He'd walked out of prison in 2017 and been fully cleared in 2019. He had about 6 years of freedom in all, roughly 4 of them fully exonerated, the weight completely gone. He did not get to keep them for long. In the autumn of 2023, Christopher Tapp died. He was in Las Vegas, and he died on November 5, 2023, following an incident at a strip resort. He was 47 years old. The Clark County coroner later ruled his death a homicide. After everything, after 20 years wrongly imprisoned and a hard-won return to freedom, his life ended far too soon. That is the last fact of it, stated and set down. He died about 2 years after the man who actually killed Angie Dodge was finally sentenced for it. For a short window, both truths existed in the world at the same time. The right man was in prison, and the wrongly convicted man was free and cleared. Justice in the case of Angie Dodge had arrived. It arrived 23 years late, and it cost more than it ever should have, but it arrived. He remains in the custody of the Idaho Department of Correction, held at the Idaho State Correctional Center in Kuna, south of Boise. Under the terms handed down by Judge Tingey, the earliest he could even come before a parole board falls roughly 2 decades out from his sentencing, and no parole has been taken up in the time since. With his health already broken by the heart attack he suffered behind bars in November of 2020, the 20-year floor on his sentence stands, for a man of his years, as the outer edge of a life that will almost certainly run out inside those walls first. Look closely at how narrow the window was in which Brian Dripps could disappear, because the dates are exact. He lived at 459 Orange Street from April 3rd, 1996 to August 2nd, 1996, 4 months. He moved onto that street just over 2 months before Angie was killed, and he moved off it less than 2 months after. His name sat inside the police file during the only stretch of his life when he lived within sight of her door, and then he was gone, out of Idaho Falls and out of the frame. A 1999 divorce record would later place him in Caldwell, the same western Idaho town where, 20 years on, a discarded cigarette would finally undo him. He didn't flee in the night. He simply relocated, the way people do, and the ordinariness of it was exactly what let him vanish. And the reason the vanishing worked is bound up in the calendar of the technology itself. In the summer of 1996, there was no national machine standing ready to take a crime scene profile and ring a bell on a stranger. The FBI's National DNA Database, CODS, only came online as a nationwide system in the years just after Angie's murder. Even once it existed, it could only match a crime scene sample against people already entered into it, people arrested or convicted of qualifying offenses whose profiles had been logged. Brian Dripps wasn't in it. There was no record of him for the system to find. So the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case, that lone male profile, had nothing on the other side of the comparison to match against. It was a key with no lock for more than 20 years. Justice arrived in the case of Angie Dodge, and it arrived late, but it arrived. It didn't come from the neighborhood canvas, or the interrogation room, or the confession they built and broke a young man to get. It came from a mother who watched the tapes and refused to look away, from Carol Dodge, who lost her daughter and then spent years fighting to free the wrong man convicted of taking her. It came from a scientist named CeCe Moore, working a broken 20-year-old sample until a family tree gave up a name. The evidence never changed. The people who wouldn't quit are the reason it finally spoke. Two co-workers knocked on a door on I Street on a June morning in 1996 because their friend hadn't come to work, and that wasn't like her. For 23 years, the answer to what happened behind that door sat waiting in a lab, in a single profile, close enough to touch and impossible to reach. When it was finally read, it named a man who'd lived across the street the whole time, and it cleared a man who'd lost 20 years for nothing. But the last word doesn't belong to either of them. It belongs to the girl who graduated with honors, who made necklaces of ribbons and bells, who tutored kids in math, who dreamed of building a business of her own, and who, on the last night of her life, stood in her mother's doorway and said a little joke from her childhood. "I still whittle, huh, Mommy?" Angie Raye Dodge was 18 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a whole person with a whole life ahead of her. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, and Angie stays remembered for who she was, not just for how her story ended.